They weren't prisoners. They hadn't broken the law. And yet, they were loaded onto trains, lined up in silence, tagged like parcels, sent hundreds of miles away from everything they'd ever known. From the slums of New York to the plains of Kansas, from alleyways to farmlands. They were the forgotten children of America. In the late 1800s, as industrial cities choked with poverty, thousands of children roamed the streets parentless, shoeless, and nameless. Some were orphans, others simply abandoned. The city had no place for them, and so a radical idea was born, one that would change their lives forever. Put them on trains, send them west, give them new homes, new names, new identities. Between 1854 and 1929, over 200,000 children were shipped across the country in what became known as the Orphan Train Movement, the largest forced child migration in American history. To some, it was salvation. To others, it was exile. But for many, it was the beginning of a life spent searching for who they were and why they were sent away. This is not just a story about history. It's about memory, morality, and the cost of forgetting. This is the story of the Orphan Trains. In the shadows of America's rising cities, long before skyscrapers kissed the clouds and neon signs lit up Broadway, there was a different kind of growth. Silent, invisible, and forgotten. By the late 1800s, New York City was overflowing. Immigrants arrived daily in search of hope. But what they found was a city suffocating under the weight of its own ambition. The streets teemed with horses, carts, and chaos. But below the noise, buried in alleyways, beneath stairwells, and behind crumbling tenement walls, lived a generation with no name, no papers, and often no parents. Children, thousands of them. Some orphaned by disease, others abandoned by parents crushed by poverty, and many more, simply lost in the blur of a city that had no room for them. They were called street Arabs, gutter kids, urchins. Some slept on rooftop chimneys to stay warm. Others huddled under bridges, curled into stairwells, or roamed the streets in gangs, barefoot and hardened by survival. Their faces didn't make headlines. Their stories didn't stir votes. They were ghosts, small, hungry, and invisible. In 1853, the Children's Aid Society estimated that over 30,000 homeless children roamed New York's streets. 30,000, the size of a small city. And this was just one city. Orphanages tried to help, but most were overcrowded, underfunded, and often more punishing than protective. In many, children were beaten for bedwetting, starved for misbehavior, and separated from siblings without explanation. Outside, industry boomed. Railroads were being built. Cotton was being spun. Money was changing hands. But for the children, America's youngest, most vulnerable citizens, the future was less than a whisper. And so, an idea was born. An idea to take these forgotten children and ship them west, not to be saved, but to be scattered like seeds, to start over, to disappear. But before the trains, there was this, a nation full of lost children waiting for someone to claim them. His name was Charles Loring Brace, a man with kind eyes, a preacher's tone, and a revolutionary idea. Born in 1826 to a well-off family in Connecticut, Brace was no stranger to comfort, but he rejected it. He turned away from the pulpit and toward the gutters of New York, where he believed the real salvation was needed. To Brace, the streets weren't just dirty, they were dangerous. He saw children growing up in vice, crime, and moral decay. To him, poverty wasn't just economic, it was spiritual. He feared that if these children were left to the streets, they wouldn't just grow up to be poor, they would grow up to be criminals. In 1853, he founded the Children's Aid Society, an organization rooted in Christian values, but fueled by social urgency. Brace believed that city slums were a breeding ground for delinquency. His solution? Remove the children. Take them far away to the countryside, to farms, to fresh air and honest work. Thus, the Orphan Train Movement was born. At first glance, it was an act of compassion. Brace wanted to rescue these children, give them a second chance. He envisioned wholesome farm families raising them with discipline, faith, and opportunity. The West was booming with new towns and new lives. Why not send the forgotten children there to start over? But behind this noble vision was something more unsettling. A quiet judgment. Brace didn't just want to save the poor, he wanted to reform them. He believed that by placing these children in rural Protestant homes, away from Catholic immigrant neighborhoods, they could be reshaped, morally, culturally, racially. To some, he was a savior, a man who saw worth in those others ignored. To others, he was a social engineer, a man who saw children as clay to be molded into a more acceptable American image. Brace never saw himself as cruel. He called the orphan trains placing out. But there was no follow-up, no system of protection, no plan for what happened next. Once the train pulled away, the child's fate was entirely in the hands of strangers. Was he a visionary or a misguided reformer? Perhaps he was both. Because history rarely gives us saints. More often, it gives us men like Charles Loring Brace, armed with good intentions, shadowed by blind spots. The whistle screamed, steam hissed, and the doors of the iron giant creaked open. For the children of the orphan trains, this was the moment their lives split in two, before and after. Dressed in donated clothes, many of them too big or too small, they clutched hope chests barely larger than a suitcase. Inside, a Bible, a comb, perhaps a letter from a nun, or a name tag scribbled in pencil. Around some necks hung cardboard signs that read simply, "I am an orphan. Please take care of me." They lined up, children as young as 3, no taller than the train wheels beside them. Some held the hands of younger siblings. Others stood alone, eyes darting from the crowd to the conductors, to the distant countryside they couldn't yet imagine. They didn't know where they were going. They only knew they were leaving. The journey west wasn't glamorous. It was long, exhausting, and confusing. These weren't vacation trains. There were no beds, no comforts. The children ate when they were fed, slept when they could, and tried to hold on to the small bits of routine taught to them back in the homes or institutions. Some sang songs to pass the time. Others cried silently through the night. And outside the windows, America blurred by. Endless tracks, forests, wheat fields, snowy plains. Town after town, station after station. A land of promise or punishment, depending on where the train stopped for you. Chaperones, often priests, nuns, or staff from the Children's Aid Society, did what they could. But with dozens of children and no official system of checks, many were left to manage their own fears. They'd rehearse scripts. "My name is Sarah. I can sweep. I know how to work the fields." They'd been told to smile, to stand straight, to be polite. Because soon, they'd be put on display, like goods at auction. They didn't know it yet, but when the train finally stopped, they wouldn't be welcomed home. They'd be picked, judged, and sometimes claimed, not as sons and daughters, but as workers, servants, or replacements for children lost. And so they rode, wide-eyed and fragile, into the unknown. 75,000 children, dozens of trains, thousands of stops, and one question that none of them could answer. Would this be a new beginning, or just a different kind of abandonment? The train screeched to a halt at another small town station. A church bell rang in the distance, and a curious crowd had already gathered on the platform. Some came with kind hearts, others came with empty barns. As the doors opened, the children stepped out into a world of judging eyes. Some wore their best donated clothes. Others still had the dust of the journey clinging to their sleeves. A few looked up with timid smiles. Most kept their gaze fixed on their shoes. They were here to be chosen, but not adopted. not in the way we understand it today. Instead, families, or in many cases farmers, would look the children over, asking about their age, health, and skills. Boys were often preferred, strong backs for the field. Girls were wanted for kitchen work or to care for younger children. Some towns even held them up on stages, literally, like livestock at auction. Can you milk a cow? Are you good with sewing? Do you pray before meals? And if a family was interested, they signed a paper. Just like that, the child went home with them. No background checks, no follow-up visits, no protection. Because in those days, the idea of child welfare barely existed. Some children found warmth behind those doors. Kind families who raised them like their own, gave them education, discipline, and above all, love. But many others were not so lucky. They became cheap labor on remote farms, waking at dawn to milk cows, chop wood, scrub floors, not as sons or daughters, but as servants. Some were beaten, underfed, or never sent to school. A few tried to run away and disappeared, and with little to no government oversight, no one came looking. The organizations behind the orphan trains often lost track of the children within months. Their names faded into local records, or were never written at all. For some townspeople, the children were a solution to their own hardships, extra hands to keep the farm alive. But for the children, especially the youngest, it felt like a silent sentence. They had escaped the slums, the streets, the orphanages, only to find a different kind of struggle, hidden beneath white picket fences and golden wheat fields. And yet, many endured. They grew up without a name, without a birth certificate, without a past, but with a work ethic and quiet strength that only survival can teach. Still, the question lingered. Were they rescued, or simply recycled? Some children never made it into family portraits. They didn't grow old on Midwestern porches or leave behind legacy farms. They simply vanished. Their names are missing from records. Their faces, absent from photo albums. Their stories, unwritten. They were the ones who were abused, rejected, runaways, or simply handed off like unwanted parcels from one home to the next, until the trail grew cold. Many towns never bothered to report when a child left. There were no national databases, no ID cards, no standard follow-up. The Children's Aid Society and other organizers of the orphan trains may have begun with noble intentions, but their system of placement was alarmingly fragile. Once a child left the train and entered a new home, they were often forgotten by the very people who placed them. If a child was too sickly to work, they were passed on. If a boy misbehaved, he might be beaten or kicked out. If a girl didn't meet expectations, she could be sent away, sometimes to even worse fates. And sometimes, they just ran. Little is known about these children. Only vague anecdotes passed down, hints in letters, whispers in town lore. Some became drifters, others criminals. Some likely perished unnoticed and unnamed. A few were taken in by distant neighbors or strangers, but most faded into the vast loneliness of America's heartland. No guardian, no record, no justice. Even more chilling were the quiet tragedies. The children whose abuse was hidden behind closed doors, behind respectable farmhouses. Girls who became housemaids in their own foster homes. Boys who labored until their backs bent, their spirits dulled. Some were buried with no markers, no visitors, no memories left behind, as if they'd never existed. And the system kept going. The trains kept rolling. Because for every child who disappeared, there were dozens more waiting to be placed, and no time to look back. These weren't just stories lost to time. They were children lost to silence. And while the Orphan Train Movement may have helped many, it also left behind a haunting question. How many of them were saved, and how many were simply erased? Long after the train stopped running, their echoes remained, not in station whistles or newspaper headlines, but in quiet bedrooms, restless dreams, and aching silences that spanned decades. These children grew into adults, fathers, mothers, workers, soldiers. But inside, many remain the same frightened child who once boarded a train with a name tag and a hope chest. First-hand accounts from surviving orphan train riders reveal something deeper than lost childhoods. They speak of fragmented identities, of not knowing where they came from, of looking in the mirror and seeing a stranger's eyes. "I never belonged anywhere," one survivor wrote in her diary. "They gave me a new name, a new family, a new religion, but no one ever asked who I was before the train." Some were told to forget their pasts, to never speak of the city, or erase their parents from memory. For many, shame replaced nostalgia. Imagine growing up wondering, why was I given away? Did my mother love me? Was I too much, or not enough? Some survivors speak of never celebrating birthdays, because no one remembered their real date. Some avoided attachments altogether, terrified of losing again. Others buried their emotions, wore silence like armor, and passed down that same emotional distance to their own children, unknowingly spreading the trauma across generations. Psychologists now call it developmental trauma, the kind that shapes how we love, how we trust, and how we see ourselves. Back then, it was just called getting on with life. No therapy, no guidance, no acknowledgement. They were expected to be grateful, to smile in photographs and say thank you, to assimilate and disappear into the American fabric, to leave behind the dirt and noise of the cities, and never speak of the train. But trauma doesn't obey silence. It festers. It returns in memories, in night terrors, in the way a hand trembles when passing a train station. And so, beneath the veneer of survival, many orphan train riders carried invisible wounds, scars no one could see, scars they couldn't name. They were children who didn't just lose homes. They lost histories, and sometimes, even themselves. Sometimes, rarely, the letters found their way. A faded envelope, a newspaper clipping, a name whispered by a nurse in a final breath. And from those fragile breadcrumbs came the impossible: reunion. Decades after the orphan train stopped running, some riders, now elderly, began searching, and some were found. A mother in her 80s meeting her son for the first time in 65 years. Two sisters reunited by DNA tests, having lived only blocks apart for decades. A man who, after a lifetime of questions, finally stood beside the grave of the father he never knew. The hugs came slowly, the words even slower. Because what do you say to someone you've loved from afar your whole life, but never really knew? For some, the reunion brought closure. For others, more questions. Why didn't you come for me? Did you ever look? Did you know where I was? The past was a maze of sealed records, changed names, and forgotten truths. And even when families were reunited, the years between them couldn't always be bridged. The government eventually acknowledged the Orphan Train program. Museums were built, plaques installed, apologies whispered. But can you make amends for stolen roots? Can you repair a childhood with a monument? Some survivors chose forgiveness, others chose silence. But almost all agreed on one thing: they were never truly orphans. They were taken, not always saved, and they never forgot the sound of that train pulling away. The orphan trains no longer run. The stations are silent now, boarded up, overgrown, or gone. No crowds, no name tags, no children waiting in line. But listen closely, and you might still hear them. the shuffle of tiny boots on wooden platforms, the hushed cries muffled by the roar of a departing train, the names whispered into the wind, names that were once identities, then labels, then losses. Between 1854 and 1929, nearly 250,000 children were shipped across America, not for vacations, not for school, but to be replaced, rebranded, and reassigned. Many found homes, many didn't. All of them carried something that never quite unpacked, the memory of being forgotten. We don't see them in history books. There are no national holidays for their grief, no statues for the ones who disappeared. But their stories, your story, matters. So the next time you pass a quiet railway track, imagine the echoes, the laughter that never lasted, the goodbyes that were never answered, the children who watched their lives disappear behind them. Let us not forget them again. If this story moved you, share it. If you felt their silence, speak for them. Like, comment, and subscribe to help keep these voices alive. Because some echoes were never meant to fade.